The night it happened, there were 340 people in the room. That detail matters. Not because any of them saw anything, they didn't, but because Cornelius Langston III made a point of reading the threat out loud at his table to 7 witnesses and then laughing at it. He held the printed program up so his dinner companions could see page 3. He read it in a voice that carried just far enough to be heard by the adjacent table, which was the point. The threat was that a piece from the Langston collection, specifically the Moriarty necklace, a 1920s Art Deco brooch and chain combination appraised at $4.2 million, would not be in his possession by Sunday midnight. This was Saturday. The gala was at the Metropolitan Museum. The necklace was currently fastened to his left lapel in plain sight, under 3 chandeliers, surrounded by his own private security team and $200,000 worth of event insurance that covered the collection pieces he'd chosen to wear that evening. He set the program down. He picked up his wine glass. He said to no one in particular that whoever had printed this nonsense had a great deal of imagination and very little understanding of how the world actually worked. By Sunday morning, the necklace was gone. The velvet display case in his private study, the one with the coated lock, the motion sensor, and the humidity control panel that cost more than most people's cars, was not broken into. It was not tampered with. The lock had been opened correctly. Inside, where the Moriarty necklace should have been resting on its custom foam mount, there was instead a single printed program from the previous evening's gala. Page 3 was circled in red ink. The security footage from every camera in the building showed nothing useful. The private investigators his lawyers hired within 48 hours of the discovery reviewed 11 hours of footage and concluded, in a written report that cost him $60,000, that they could not determine when or how the piece had been removed. What they could determine was that it had been there at 11:47 p.m. on Saturday, when one of his security team had visually confirmed it was still on his jacket, and that by the time he placed it in the display case at 1:15 a.m. Sunday morning, a habit so ingrained it required no thought, something had already changed. Something that wouldn't be discovered until he opened the case again at 9 that morning with a cup of coffee in his hand, and the particular satisfaction of a man who has just proven conclusively that he cannot be touched. That satisfaction lasted 4 seconds. Then the coffee cup was on the floor, and Cornelius Langston III was staring at page 3 of his own gala program, and the room was very quiet. This is where the story starts. Not at the gala, and not at the discovery. It starts 6 weeks earlier in a coffee shop in the West 40s, when the gentleman sat across from a woman named Denise Okafor and listened to her for 2 hours without saying very much at all. He had a habit of listening that some people found unnerving, not the performance of listening, not the nodding and the affirming sounds, but actual listening, the kind where you stop composing your response and simply take in what's being said. Denise Okafor was not someone who needed him to respond. She needed someone to sit still while she said it all out loud, because she'd been saying it in her head for 11 years, and the weight of that had begun to show in ways she couldn't hide anymore. She was 53. She had spent 22 years as a curatorial assistant at a gallery in Chelsea, the kind of position that sounds prestigious until you understand what it actually pays and what it actually requires, which is everything you have, and a willingness to accept that credit will flow upward and compensation will not. She knew art in the way that only comes from being around it constantly, handling it, cataloging it, researching provenance and condition and market history until the knowledge becomes instinctive. She could look at a piece and tell you within a year when it was made. She could identify a restoration from across a room. What she could not do, for the 22 years she spent acquiring this knowledge, was leverage it into anything that resembled financial security, because the people who employed her had structured the industry specifically to prevent that. Her mother had been a sculptor. Not famous, not the kind of famous that gets retrospectives and auction records, but known, respected in certain circles, the kind of artist who sold work consistently and taught workshops and built something small and real over 40 years of sustained effort. When her mother died, Denise expected to inherit the estate, which consisted primarily of unsold work and, more significantly, the rights to 3 pieces that had been acquired by the Langston collection in 2003. The acquisition had happened during a period when her mother was ill and needed money quickly. Cornelius Langston III had made an offer through an intermediary. The offer was low, significantly below market, and her mother's lawyer had said so. But the payment was immediate, and the alternative was a bank loan with terms that were also, in their own way, a form of extraction. Her mother signed. The rights transferred. The 3 pieces became part of the Langston collection, which meant they also became part of the Langston Foundation, which meant they generated no income for anyone except Cornelius Langston III's tax attorneys. 11 years after the acquisition, streaming platforms and digital licensing had made the reproduction rights to those 3 pieces worth something. Not $4.2 million. That kind of money lived in a different atmosphere. But enough. Enough to matter. Enough to change what Denise Okafor's retirement looked like. Enough that when she found out, through a contact at a licensing firm, that the Langston Foundation had been collecting those royalties for 8 years without ever notifying her, she sat in her apartment for 3 days before she could make herself pick up the phone. Her lawyer told her the contract was clean. Her mother had signed away everything. There was no misrepresentation she could prove, no fraud, no actionable claim. The intermediary had represented Langston accurately. The price was low, but low prices were not illegal. The conversation lasted 22 minutes and cost her $400. She had heard about the gentleman the way people hear about things that exist slightly outside the official record, through someone who knew someone, through a story told quietly at a dinner party that the teller insisted was true, through the particular quality of attention that certain stories receive when they're being passed from person to person, not because they're entertaining, but because they're necessary. She had reached out through a contact she trusted. The contact had passed the message along. 3 weeks later, someone called her from an unknown number and suggested the coffee shop in the West 40s. She told him everything. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked her one question, which was whether the 3 pieces were currently on display anywhere or in storage. She told him they rotated. 2 were in long-term storage at a climate-controlled facility in New Jersey, and 1 was currently on loan to a museum in Boston until the end of the fiscal year. He thanked her. He asked her not to contact him and to say nothing about their meeting to anyone. Then he left a $20 on the table for a $12 check and walked out into the November afternoon. 6 weeks later, she received a phone call from a licensing administrator at a firm she didn't recognize. The administrator explained that the rights to 3 sculptures, she recognized the titles immediately, felt something shift in her chest at the sound of them, had been transferred to a newly established estate trust in her name, and that there were 8 years of accrued royalties awaiting distribution, and that she would be receiving documentation by certified mail within 10 business days. The administrator had a pleasant, professional voice and answered every question she asked, and one she didn't ask, which was whether this was real by reading her the trust registration number and suggesting she verify it with her own attorney before signing anything. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time after the call ended. Then she called her attorney, who verified it, and called her back 2 hours later, sounding genuinely confused about the mechanism but absolutely certain about the outcome. The 3 pieces had come home. Denise Okafor would spend the next several months learning what it meant to be the holder of rights she'd been told would never be hers. She never met the gentleman again. She never found out how he'd done it. She had one theory, which she kept to herself, and which she was fairly certain was wrong in its details and right in its shape, that whatever happened, it had happened at the gala, and that the Moriarty necklace was not the point but the price. She wasn't wrong about the shape. Cornelius Langston III had not arrived at his position through accident or inheritance alone, though he had inherited plenty. He had also worked, if working is the right word, for the specific activity of identifying undervalued assets and acquiring them at moments of maximum vulnerability in their owners' lives. His grandfather had started the family fortune in real estate, buying distressed properties in neighborhoods that were then redrawn around the properties, rather than in spite of them. His father had expanded into finance, running a fund that specialized in the kind of returns that required not asking certain questions about certain mechanisms. Cornelius had taken the 3rd generation in a direction that felt, from the outside, like refinement, art, philanthropy, cultural stewardship. He sat on 4 museum boards. He had a room named after him at a university whose endowment he had helped restructure in ways that were complicated to explain, but simple in their effect, which was that the university had less money than before, and he had more. The Langston Foundation had been established 17 years ago as a vehicle for charitable giving, and was described in every profile written about him as a genuine commitment to cultural preservation. What the profiles did not describe, because the profiles were written from press releases and conversations he controlled, was the tax architecture underneath the commitment. The foundation donated his personal collection, pieces he acquired at suppressed prices, back to itself, at appraised market value, generating a deduction that offset a significant portion of his annual income. The pieces stayed in his possession, on loan from the foundation to his home and to select museum exhibitions, because the foundation's loan policies were written by the same attorneys who wrote the acquisition agreements. The foundation paid nothing in taxes. The artist whose work formed the collection received nothing from the tax benefit. The culture was preserved. Cornelius Langston III's effective tax rate was, in the years this arrangement had been in place, something that would have been recognizable as a number, but not recognizable as a fair share by anyone who had ever paid a paycheck's worth of withholding without access to a foundation. He was not stupid. He was careful. He had lawyers who were paid specifically to ensure that everything was structured, so that there was no version of challenge that could succeed. When a journalist had written a piece 3 years ago attempting to trace the acquisition pattern, the low prices, the distressed sellers, the timing, the piece had been significantly revised before publication, following a conversation between the journalist's editor and the foundation's communications director, and the revised version had focused primarily on his museum donations, which were, it must be acknowledged, substantial. He had won every engagement anyone had ever brought against him, not because he was more principled than his opponents, but because he had more resources, more lawyers, more time, and a complete institutional certainty that the mechanisms of accountability had been either captured or circumvented before anyone arrived to deploy them. This certainty was not arrogance in the ordinary sense. It was the calm of a man who had tested the system repeatedly and found it reliable. What he had not accounted for was someone who wasn't using the system. The gentleman had studied Cornelius Langston III for 3 weeks before the coffee shop meeting and 3 weeks after it. Not because he needed that much time to understand the target. The shape of the operation was clear within 48 hours, but because the specific mechanism required a specific kind of timing, and timing required knowing the target's routines with the same precision the target applied to everything else. Langston had 3 routines that were effectively unvarying. He arrived at his office in Midtown at 8:15 a.m. on weekdays, carried a specific briefcase, and did not take meetings before 9:30. On the 2nd and 4th Saturday of every month, he attended a private dinner at a club on East 60th Street, where he had been a member for 21 years. And for charitable events, the galas, the openings, the benefit dinners that were the social infrastructure of his world, he wore pieces from the collection. Always the same category of piece, something significant enough to signal the collection's quality, small enough to be worn comfortably, and chosen from whatever section of the collection he was currently positioning for his next round of appraisals. The Moriarty necklace was the current positioning piece. It had been appraised 18 months ago at $3.8 million. The new appraisal, which his foundation had commissioned for tax purposes, was scheduled for the spring. In the interim, it needed to be seen at events, in photographs, in the kind of social context that establish provenance and cultural significance for objects that will eventually be donated to the foundation at the higher appraised value and generate the corresponding deduction. The necklace being worn to the Met Gala was not a personal choice. It was a financial one. He wore it on the outside of his jacket, over the lapel where it caught the light. He had worn it to 3 events in the past 4 months and would wear it to 2 more before the spring appraisal. His security team knew it, knew to keep it in visual range, knew that it went back into the display case at home whenever he returned from an event. The ritual was so established that the security team lead, a man named Bryce who had worked for Langston for 9 years, could have recited the necklace protocol in his sleep. Bryce was competent. The gentleman had assessed this early and adjusted accordingly, not around Bryce, through him. The gala invitation list had been finalized 6 weeks before the event. Vendors, catering, florals, audiovisual, valet had their staff lists submitted to the museum's event coordinator 3 weeks out. The museum's event coordinator used a staffing management system that had been updated the previous year with a new platform. One of those transitions where the institutional knowledge of how the old system worked hadn't fully transferred to the new one, and where the credentials management had some gaps that nobody had specifically been assigned to close because the previous person who handled it had left, and the new person was still learning the old system's logic while also learning the new one. The catering company that had been contracted for the gala had a supervisor role on the staff list that was distinct from the line staff, a different credential level, different access tier, different relationship to the security perimeter. The supervisor position coordinated between the kitchen and the floor, which meant movement through areas that line staff didn't access. It was not a glamorous position. It was not a position anyone paid attention to, in the way that people at events of this kind don't pay attention to the person who appears and refills the water glasses and disappears again, because that person is part of the infrastructure, and infrastructure is invisible by design. The gentleman was not on the catering staff list. He did not need to be. What he needed was to be where the list said someone else was. Someone who existed in the system, had the right credential tier, and whose absence on the night would not be noticed until it was examined in retrospect, by which point the examination would be of a completed event with no apparent incident, which meant the absence wouldn't be examined at all. What this required The specific mechanism, the exact point of entry into a chain of institutional trust that looked from the outside unbroken, is not something this story will hand you. What happened, happened. The result is what the evidence shows. A man in a supervisor's uniform with the right credential, moving through the right spaces, at the right moments, in a building full of cameras that captured exactly what they were positioned to capture, which was the perimeter, not the interior, because the interior was managed by the caterer's own coordination, not the museum's security team, and the two systems were adjacent but not integrated in the way everyone assumed they were. He was in the room for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He moved the way someone moves when they belong in a space. Not quickly, not slowly, not with the particular stillness of someone trying not to be noticed. He moved with the mild purposefulness of someone managing a detail. He had 4 interactions with guests, all brief, all initiated by the guests, all resolved without incident. He had 2 interactions with actual catering staff, both operational. He had 1 interaction with a member of Langston's security team, which lasted approximately 20 seconds and resulted in the security team member returning his attention to the room. Langston checked the necklace at 10 p.m. He checked it again at 10:47, which was when the last photograph of it was taken by an event photographer whose work appeared on the Foundation's social media the following Tuesday, before anyone knew there was anything to be careful about. At 11:47, Bryce made a visual confirmation. The gentleman left the building at 11:12. Between 10:47 and 11:12, there was a window. 35 minutes in a room with 340 people and 11 security cameras and a man who had checked his lapel twice. The window existed because of a specific sequence of events in Arc 3 of the evening. A toast that required Langston to stand, a moment of particular social exposure during which the room's attention was structured in a specific way. A physical configuration that the gentleman had been watching the shape of for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Patient, the way water is patient, moving when the gradient appeared. What exactly happened in those 35 minutes? What specific action? In what specific sequence? Using what specific method? Is the thing this story doesn't tell you. Not because it's unknown, but because a magician who explains the trick has nothing left. What you know is what Bryce confirmed at 11:47, and what Langston confirmed at 1:15 in the morning when he placed the necklace in the display case, and what Langston found at 9 the following morning when he opened the case again. What you know is that the necklace was there, and then it wasn't. And where it wasn't, there was page 3. Now, consider what had been set in motion 3 weeks before the gala, in the channel through which the rights to Denise Okafor's mother's 3 sculptures were eventually transferred. Consider what it meant that the Moriarty necklace, an object whose value existed primarily as a tax instrument, a piece that had been appraised at a number the Foundation needed it to be appraised at, was no longer available for the spring appraisal cycle. Consider what happens to the deduction structure when the centerpiece of the positioning strategy is absent, and the Foundation's attorneys have to explain to the IRS in a filing year when the Foundation's acquisition history is already drawing low-level scrutiny from an agent in the Northeast Regional Office who has been doing this for 18 years and has a particular interest in art foundations. Why the most significant piece in the current cycle has gone missing in circumstances that the Foundation can neither fully explain nor fully document without drawing more attention to the question of how the piece was acquired in the first place. This is the checkmate that doesn't announce itself as a checkmate. Langston couldn't report the theft to police without triggering an investigation into the Foundation's acquisition records that his attorneys had specifically structured to avoid scrutiny. He couldn't make an insurance claim without documentation that would raise the same questions. He couldn't tell the story publicly. The story of how someone had told him in his own gala program, in front of 7 witnesses who could be deposed, exactly what was going to happen. And he had read it out loud and laughed, without conceding that he had been specifically targeted, which opened a different set of questions about why someone would target him in this specific way, for this specific piece, with this specific kind of precision. He couldn't do anything. That was the calling card, not just the program on the velvet foam, the silence he was required to maintain, the calculation he had to run and rerun, and always arrive at the same answer, which was that the cost of pursuing the loss exceeded the cost of absorbing it. He absorbed it. Bryce was let go 3 months later with a severance and a non-disclosure agreement because Langston needed someone to have been responsible, and Bryce was the shape that fit. Bryce, who had done everything correctly, who had confirmed the necklace at 11:47 and had no way of knowing that confirmation came 25 minutes after the thing he was confirming had already changed, signed the agreement because the severance was fair and because he had a family and because fighting Cornelius Langston III in an employment dispute had a known outcome. The gentleman heard about the severance through the same network that had brought Denise Okafor to his attention. He sat with that information for a while. He had expected it. The adversary needing an outlet for the loss, a person-shaped explanation for something that had no person to blame in any way that helped. He hadn't expected to feel anything specific about it. He found that he did. He found Bryce. Not immediately and not dramatically, through a series of intermediary contacts that left no trail anyone would think to follow. What Bryce received 4 months after signing the severance agreement was a phone call from a security consulting firm he'd never heard of, offering him a position that paid 30% more than his previous salary, with a client list that was vague in its specifics but credible in its references. The firm existed. The references checked out. The position was real. Bryce took the job and was good at it because he was good at his work and had always been. And the firm's other clients, whoever they were, whatever the firm's actual relationship to any of this, found nothing to complain about. The gentleman did not consider this a debt paid or a wrong righted. Bryce had been collateral in a plan that hadn't intended him as collateral, and the gentleman's code had a specific clause about collateral that he hadn't written down anywhere because he didn't need to. He had known going in that Langston's first move after the loss would be to find someone to absorb it. He hadn't been able to prevent that without compromising the operation. He could do something about it after. So he did. This is the part of the code that people who romanticize it miss. It isn't about the elegant move or the satisfying reveal or the checkmate that closes the puzzle. It's about what you do with the consequences you didn't want and couldn't avoid. Every plan has them. The gentleman's plans had them too. The difference was that he stayed present for them. Denise Okafor received the royalty documentation in early December, 10 business days after the phone call, exactly as the licensing administrator had promised. Her attorney helped her set up the disbursement structure, the accrued amount, 8 years of reproduction licensing, at rates that had grown significantly as the digital market matured, was not life-changing in the way that the word is usually meant. It was specific problem-solving changing. It was the difference between a retirement that required constant management and anxiety and one that had a floor. Her mother had worked for 40 years to build something. Some of it had been taken at a moment of vulnerability through a mechanism designed precisely to exploit that vulnerability while remaining technically clean. Some of it came back. She kept the royalty statement in a drawer, not displayed, not framed, just there, in the drawer with the other documents that mattered, the ones she returned to periodically to confirm that what she remembered was real. On the first anniversary of receiving it, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and pulled it out and read the numbers again, which were the same numbers they had always been, and felt something she had difficulty naming precisely, which was the feeling of a correction having been made in a world that had told her corrections like this didn't happen. The gentleman was not present for any of this. He was present for very little of what his operations produced, by design and by temperament. He set things in motion and then stepped away from the machinery of the outcome, because watching outcomes was a different kind of work than planning operations, and the two required different states of mind that didn't coexist well in the same person at the same time. He had, by now, been doing this long enough that the early questions about justification, about whether any of this was his to do, about the distance between what was right and what was legal and what was possible, had resolved into something quieter. Not certainty. He didn't trust certainty, but a settled understanding of what he was for and what he wasn't for, and a clear internal register that told him with reasonable reliability when he was operating within his own limits and when he was approaching the edge of them. The Langston operation had been within his limits. The specific instrument, the Moriarty necklace, had been chosen because it was the fulcrum of a tax structure that was itself an instrument of extraction, because removing it would generate consequences that the target couldn't address without generating worse ones, and because the mechanism of its removal could be constructed in a way that left a specific and legible calling card without exposing the secondary operation that was the actual purpose. The necklace was not the point. The necklace was the price of the point, paid by someone who had set the price himself by choosing what to wear and where to wear it and how to structure the deduction cycle around it. The advance notice, the program, page 3, had served two functions. The first was practical. It told him something about Langston's psychology that he needed to confirm, which was that the response to a direct public threat would be to double down on display rather than to reduce exposure. He had assessed this from the research, but needed to confirm it from behavior. Langston's decision to wear the necklace to the gala rather than leave it in the case, to use the event as a demonstration of invulnerability, confirmed the assessment and made the rest of the operation significantly cleaner. The second function was what it always was: code. The gentleman didn't operate in the dark, he announced. The announcement was part of the contract he held with himself, the line between what he was and what he refused to become. The last thing he heard about Cornelius Langston III, through the same network that kept him informed about the periphery of the operations he ran, was that the spring appraisal cycle had been delayed, that the Foundation's current filing was under informal review by the same IRS agent who had been watching art foundations for 18 years, and that one of the 3 pieces in the collection most central to the current tax structure, not the Moriarty necklace, a different piece, had been quietly returned to the family of the artist from whom it had been acquired, in settlement of a claim that the Foundation's attorneys had apparently decided, on reflection, was worth settling quietly rather than defending publicly. He heard this and felt what he usually felt at this stage, which was not satisfaction exactly. Satisfaction implied a completed circuit, an emotion that had found its resolution and was ready to move on. But something more like recognition, the shape of how these things concluded. The way that a stone dropped in one place produced ripples in directions that couldn't be fully predicted, but could be generally anticipated by someone who had been dropping stones long enough to develop a feel for the water He had been dropping stones for a long time. There's a specific kind of power that operates by making you believe the rules don't apply to it. Not raw power. Raw power is obvious, and obvious things can be addressed. This is the refined kind, the kind that has spent decades arranging the furniture of consequence so that every chair faces away from it. The kind that laughs when warned because it has been warned before and the warnings have never landed, and there's no particular reason to believe this one is different from all the others. The gentleman understood this kind of power because he had spent years studying it, not with anger. Anger was a tool, but a crude one, and crude tools produce crude results. With something more like scientific interest, the patience of someone who wants to understand a system completely before deciding what to do about it. What he had found consistently was that this kind of power had a specific vulnerability that it created for itself and couldn't see. The certainty of invulnerability, the absolute conviction that the mechanisms of accountability had all been addressed, that the perimeter was complete, that the only threats worth taking seriously were the ones that looked like threats. The janitor with the master key, the IT contractor whose badge nobody questioned, the catering supervisor moving through spaces that two adjacent security systems both assumed the other was monitoring. The power that laughs at warnings is the power that has decided at some level what shape a real threat looks like. And that decision, that act of pattern recognition that closes the mind to what doesn't fit the pattern, is the gap. Not a flaw in the wall. A door the wall's owner built themselves, opened themselves, and stood in front of themselves, convinced it was the safest place to stand. He had walked through a lot of those doors. If you've stayed this far, and if you're hearing this, you have, then you already understand something about why these stories keep getting told. It's not the necklace. It was never the necklace. It's the program on page 3 sitting in the empty case, and the 9 seconds of silence before Cornelius Langston III understood what it meant. It's Denise Okafor at her kitchen table, reading numbers that were the same numbers they had always been. It's Bryce, who did his job correctly and was made the explanation for something that had no explanation anyone was allowed to look at, getting a phone call 4 months later from a firm he'd never heard of. It's the understanding that the game being rigged doesn't mean it can't be played differently. It means someone has to be willing to learn a different set of rules. The real ones. The ones underneath the official ones. The ones that govern what's actually possible when you stop treating the official version as the ceiling. The gentleman didn't change the system. He didn't expose it or dismantle it or give a speech about it. He moved through it sideways in the spaces it had decided were safe to leave unguarded. And he left, in those spaces, something specific. An object, a program, a phone call from a firm that exists, a royalty statement in a drawer. The question this story leaves you with is the one worth sitting with. Not whether you would have believed the warning. You know the answer to that. Whether you believe right now that something like this is actually possible. Whether the world as it works, the world with the lawyers and the foundations and the IRS agents who've been watching for 18 years and the secondhand stories that get revised before publication, has space in it for the version of events you just heard. And if your answer is yes, what would you do with that? Think about it. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you've been here from the beginning, if you've stayed through every episode of The Gentleman's Game, you know where to leave your answer. The comments are open. We're listening.